Power could summon men, money, and medicine, but it could not command a body to heal. The sound that tore through the Harrington ranch was not a scream, but a strangled breath, ragged, wet, and wrong. Nathan Harrington lay twisted in the wide oak bed, his skin flushed and angry red, his chest rising as though each breath were an argument his body was losing. Outside the bedroom door, boots scraped the floorboards as men shifted their weight, whispering, waiting. Inside, a doctor wiped his hands on a linen cloth already stained with sweat and failure. Caleb Harrington stood at the foot of the bed, his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone white. He owned more land than any man for 50 miles. He could buy cattle towns, even loyalty. But as his son gasped again sharper this time, Caleb understood with a cold certainty that none of it meant a thing. Morning light spilled across the Montana prairie, turning the tall grass silver. The Harrington Ranch sat like a small kingdom against the open land, long barns, white fences, and a main house built to last generations. For years, it had been a place of order. Work began before sunrise. Meals were taken on time. Problems were solved with decisiveness and money. Now the house smelled of boiled water vinegar and fear. Nathan had returned from a cattle drive 3 days earlier, sunburned and laughing, his voice loud with plans for the future. By nightfall, the fever took him. By dawn, he could no longer stand. And by the second night, the ranch had sent riders in every direction. Doctors came in pairs, then alone, then in weary succession, 20 in all. Some arrived with leather cases polished to a shine, others with nervous eyes and tired horses. They checked Nathan's pulse, examined his tongue, muttered Latin words that sounded impressive and useless all at once. They argued quietly in corners and loudly at the bedside. They prescribed tonics, bleeding rest, more bleeding. Nothing worked. Caleb Harrington watched them all with the same expression, a hard stillness that had once intimidated men twice his size. But inside him, something had begun to fracture. Nathan was not just his son. He was the future of the ranch, the reason the land would endure beyond Caleb's own lifetime. Without him, the acres meant nothing. Wealth meant nothing. At the far end of the room, nearly blending into the wall, stood Eliza Moore. She was there because someone had to be. Someone had to change the linens soaked through with sweat. Someone had to bring fresh water, wipe a fevered brow, empty bowls that no one else wanted to touch. Eliza did these things quietly. Her eyes lowered, her movements practiced. She had learned early that the best way to survive a large house was to remain unnoticed. But she noticed everything. She saw the way Nathan's hands trembled when the fever spiked. She saw how his breathing changed in the afternoon, growing shallow and uneven. She noticed that the remedies offered were always the same, only delivered with different confidence. And with each failed attempt, a memory stirred her grandmother's voice, low and steady. Speaking of bark scraped thin from willow trees, of heat that must be drawn out before it burned the body dry. Eliza pushed the thought aside. She had been raised on the edges of towns by a woman who trusted what the land taught more than what books declared. That knowledge had never earned Eliza anything but raised brows and warnings to keep quiet. Doctors did not want to hear from maids. Ranchers did not want suggestions from girls who scrubbed floors. And yet, as the hours dragged on, the fever did not break. By midday, the last doctor to arrive, older with spectacles slipping down his nose, pulled Caleb aside. His voice was low, meant to be private, but Eliza heard it anyway. "I'm sorry," the man said. "We've done what we can." Caleb nodded once. He did not speak. Words would have been a surrender. When the doctor left, the room felt emptier than before. Margaret Collins, Nathan's fiancée, sat stiffly in a chair near the window, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp. She had been raised to manage appearances, not despair. This situation offended her sense of order. "This is unbearable," Margaret said at last. "We cannot just stand here." Caleb did not turn. "If you have a solution, Miss Collins," he replied evenly, now would be the time. She fell silent, her jaw tightening. Eliza moved forward to change the compress on Nathan's forehead. As she did, his eyes fluttered open just for a moment. They were unfocused, searching. His lips parted as though he were trying to speak. No sound came. Something inside Eliza settled, heavy and undeniable. She knew that look. She had seen it once before, years ago, in a small cabin with a dirt floor and a woman who had raised her. Back then, she had been too young to do anything but watch. This time, she was not. Still, she hesitated. Around her stood power and education and wealth. She had none of those things. What she had was memory and the dangerous certainty that if she did nothing, Nathan Harrington would not see another sunrise. The house clock struck 3. Outside, a wind moved through the prairie, bending the grass in slow, patient waves. Inside, Caleb Harrington finally sank into a chair, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the land itself had settled upon him. Eliza watched him, truly watched him, and understood something she had never allowed herself to think before even men like Caleb Harrington could be helpless. That was when the decision took hold. It did not come with confidence. It came with fear so sharp it made her hands tremble. But beneath it was something steadier, a refusal to let silence decide the outcome. She smoothed her apron, took a breath, and stepped forward. Sir Eliza said, her voice quiet but clear. Every head in the room turned. Margaret stared at her as though she had spoken out of turn, which she had. Caleb looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing not with anger but surprise. "Yes," he said. Eliza swallowed. She could feel her heart pounding loud in her ears. There would be no going back after this. She knew that too. "I believe," she said carefully, "there may be another way to bring the fever down." The room went still. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked. Outside, the wind pressed on indifferent. And in that fragile silence, the balance of the Harrington ranch shifted, though none of them yet understood how much. What Eliza had just offered was not merely an idea, it was a challenge to everything they believed about who was allowed to be heard and who was meant to remain unseen. Courage rarely arrives as certainty. More often it comes as fear that refuses to stay silent. For a moment after Eliza spoke, no one answered her. The silence did not feel empty. It felt crowded, thick with judgment. 20 pairs of educated eyes turned toward her, some amused, some offended, others openly hostile. The idea that a maid might suggest a remedy where trained men had failed landed like an insult dressed as desperation. Margaret Collins was the first to recover her voice. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, rising from her chair. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were sharp with offense. "My fiancé is gravely ill, and this is not the time for," she gestured vaguely at Eliza. "Folk notions." A murmur of agreement followed. One of the doctors let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Sir," another said to Caleb, "you cannot seriously consider this. We've tried every known treatment." Allowing a servant to interfere, Eliza stood very still. She had expected this. What surprised her was not their rejection, but how little it moved her now that the moment had come. The fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, but beneath it lay a steadier resolve. She had seen Nathan's breathing falter again while they spoke. Time was slipping through their hands. Caleb Harrington raised a hand. The room quieted at once. He did not look at the doctors. His gaze rested on Eliza, measuring her not by her place in the house, but by the steadiness of her posture. He had built an empire by reading people, by knowing when a man was bluffing, when he was afraid, when he was telling the truth, because he had nothing left to lose. "You believe you can help my son, Caleb," said slowly. Eliza nodded. "I believe there is a chance, sir." "A chance," one doctor scoffed. "With respect, that's hardly sufficient grounds." Caleb turned, then his voice sharpening. "Neither is certainty, it seems." That silenced them. He looked back at Eliza. "Tell me what you would do." Her mouth went dry. This was further than she had thought she would get. Still she spoke carefully, choosing each word as though it might be weighed later. "The fever needs to be drawn out," she said. "Not suppressed. Willow bark can help boiled properly, and his body must be cooled, not bled. The heat is what's killing him." Several doctors began talking at once, dismissing the idea as primitive, untested, reckless. Margaret stepped closer to Caleb, lowering her voice. "You cannot allow this," she said. "If she harms him, if I do nothing," Caleb replied just as quietly, "he will die." That truth hung between them, unadorned and undeniable. Caleb studied Eliza again. She did not beg. She did not argue. She stood as someone who understood the weight of what she was offering and the cost if she failed. "How long?" he asked. "1 hour," Eliza said. "If there is no change by then, I will step away. And if there is," he pressed. Then she said softly, "We will know." Caleb exhaled, long and controlled. He was a man accustomed to decisions that shaped land and lives. This one felt different, not because the stakes were higher, but because the certainty he relied on was gone. "Very well," he said at last. "You will have 1 hour." Margaret's face flushed. "Caleb, this is my decision," he said without looking at her. "If she fails, she will answer for it. But if she succeeds—" He let the sentence trail off. The doctors exchanged glances, some incredulous, others quietly curious despite themselves. One of them shook his head and stepped back, arms crossed. Eliza inclined her head. Relief did not touch her face. Only focus. She moved at once, requesting a clean pot, fresh water, and access to the small grove near the north fence where willows grew thick along the creek. A ranch hand was sent to gather bark under her instruction. Another fetched ice from the cellar. Every step she took was watched. As the preparations began, whispers followed her through the hallways. "She'll be blamed when it goes wrong. This is madness." Caleb heard them all and said nothing. He had made his choice. Now he would live with it. Inside the bedroom, Nathan groaned softly, his body restless against the sheets. Eliza pressed a cool cloth to his wrist, feeling the heat pulse beneath his skin. Her movements were gentle but assured, guided by memory rather than theory. As the willow bark boiled, its bitter scent filled the air. One doctor wrinkled his nose in disdain. Another watched more closely than he meant to. Eliza did not look at them. Her attention remained fixed on the patient, the rhythm of his breathing, the color of his skin, the subtle signs that spoke louder than words. Margaret stood apart, arms folded, her gaze cold. To her, Eliza was not brave. She was presumptuous, a reminder that the boundaries Margaret relied upon were not as firm as she had believed. Minutes passed, then more. The room grew tense. No one spoke. The ticking of the clock sounded unnaturally loud. Eliza administered the infusion, slowly cooling Nathan's body with careful precision. When nothing happened, at first doubt crept in, not from those watching, but from within her own chest. She pushed it aside. Fear had brought her this far. It would not stop her now. Caleb watched every movement. He had seen men gamble fortunes with less conviction than this young woman showed in silence. At the edge of the hour, Nathan's breathing hitched, then steadied. His brow dampened not with fever but sweat. Eliza's hand tightened briefly on the cloth. She did not announce it. She did not claim success. But she felt the shift. The room held its breath, unaware that it was standing on the brink of something irreversible, not just for Nathan Harrington, but for the order that had governed the Harrington Ranch for decades. Whether Eliza Moore would be lifted or destroyed by what followed remained to be seen. But one thing was already certain. She would never again be invisible. Truth does not ask for permission. It only waits for someone willing to act. The change was so subtle at first that no one trusted it. Nathan Harrington's chest rose and fell once, twice, still labored, but no longer frantic. The rasp that had torn through the room for hours softened into something closer to rhythm. Eliza felt it beneath her palm before she saw it, a faint easing of the heat that had burned against her skin all morning. She did not speak. Around her, the others leaned in without meaning to. One of the doctors glanced at the clock, then back at Nathan's face, as if checking whether time itself had shifted. Another frowned, unsettled, his certainty beginning to fray. Caleb Harrington stood motionless at the foot of the bed. He had watched markets collapse and storms erase entire herds, but this quiet turning of the tide unnerved him more than any loud disaster. Hope was a dangerous thing. He had learned that early, and yet it stirred now, unwanted and impossible to ignore. Eliza changed the cloth on Nathan's forehead, her movements careful, deliberate. The room remained silent except for the ticking clock and the low murmur of boiling water nearby. Every second felt exposed, as though the outcome depended on whether anyone dared to breathe too loudly. Then Nathan stirred. His fingers twitched first, brushing against the sheet. His brow furrowed, and a faint sound escaped his throat, not a groan this time, but something closer to a sigh. Eliza's heart gave a single hard beat. "Did you see that?" one doctor whispered. Margaret Collins rose halfway from her chair, her composure cracking just enough to reveal fear beneath. "Nathan," she said softly. His eyelids fluttered. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then they opened. Nathan's gaze was unfocused, clouded by exhaustion and heat, but it was unmistakably conscious. His lips moved, forming a sound that barely carried. "Water," he murmured. The room erupted. Chairs scraped back. Voices overlapped, surprise, disbelief, hurried explanations tumbling over one another. One doctor rushed forward, another instinctively reached to stop him. Caleb moved first, crossing the room in 2 strides and kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking despite his effort to keep it steady. "You're going to be all right." Nathan swallowed weakly, his eyes drifting toward the sound of his father's voice. Eliza stepped back, allowing space, her pulse racing, but her expression composed. She poured a small amount of water, guiding it carefully as Nathan drank. The fever had not vanished, but it had broken its grip. The danger for now had retreated. A long, collective breath seemed to pass through the room. The doctors stood frozen, their faces a study in reluctant acknowledgement. One of them cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes, "it appears the crisis has passed." Eliza turned toward him, meeting his gaze for the first time since she had begun. Her look was not defiant. It was simply honest. "It has eased," she said. "But he will need care still. Rest, proper cooling, no more bleeding." A few hours earlier, her words would have been dismissed outright. Now no one contradicted her. Margaret remained standing near the window, her hands trembling at her sides. Relief washed across her face, quickly followed by something sharper, resentment perhaps, or humiliation. She had prayed for Nathan's recovery. She had not imagined it would come by another woman's hands. Caleb straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving his son. When he finally turned, his gaze found Eliza. "You saved him," he said. Eliza shook her head. "I helped," she replied. "His body did the rest. It was not modesty. It was truth." Caleb studied her in silence, seeing now what he had not allowed himself to see. Before the steadiness, the restraint, the quiet strength that did not seek recognition. The balance of the room had shifted, and with it his understanding of the world. He commanded. "You will stay," he said. "Here, until he is fully recovered." Eliza nodded. "Of course, sir." The doctors began to gather their things, their authority diminished, their presence no longer central. Some avoided Eliza's eyes. One lingered, curiosity battling pride. "You said willow bark?" he said. "Where did you learn that?" Eliza paused. "From someone who listened to the land," she answered, and paid attention when others did not. He said nothing more. As the hours passed, Nathan drifted in and out of sleep, each breath steadier than the last. Eliza remained nearby, attentive but unobtrusive. When Caleb finally stepped out into the hall, the weight in his chest felt lighter than it had in days. Outside, the prairie stretched beneath a wide, untroubled sky. Life moved on, unaware of the small miracle that had taken place within the walls of the Harrington house. But inside, consequences were already taking shape. Margaret confronted Caleb in the corridor, her voice low but insistent. "You humiliated everyone," she said. "You let a servant make a spectacle of us." Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt something settle into place. "She saved my son," he said. "If that embarrasses you, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Margaret fell silent, her face tightening. She turned away without another word. Eliza did not hear this exchange. She was too busy tending to Nathan, adjusting blankets, noting the subtle signs of improvement that others would miss. But she felt the change in the air, the way people moved around her differently now, with caution or curiosity, where there had once been indifference. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land gold, Caleb returned to Nathan's bedside. His son slept peacefully, color slowly returning to his face. Caleb stood there a long time. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "When he is well," he said more to himself than anyone else, "things will be different." Eliza heard him this time. She did not ask what he meant. She only knew that the life she had known, the careful silence, the safety of invisibility, was already slipping away. What would replace it, she could not yet see. But she sensed with a calm that surprised her that whatever came next would demand more of her than courage alone. It would demand a choice. Once a voice is heard, it cannot be returned to silence. And once dignity is claimed, it does not ask permission to remain. Nathan Harrington's recovery did not come all at once. It unfolded in small, deliberate steps, his fever easing by degrees, his strength returning slowly, as though his body were relearning how to live. Eliza remained near, attentive without hovering, adjusting her care as his condition shifted. Each day brought a little more color to his face, a little more steadiness to his hands. The ranch followed her movements now. Where once she had passed through hallways unnoticed, people stepped aside. Some watched her with gratitude, others with suspicion. A few spoke her name carefully, as though it carried weight they did not yet understand. Caleb Harrington noticed everything. He noticed the way the doctors deferred, however reluctantly. He noticed how Margaret Collins avoided Eliza's presence, her politeness stretched thin as thread. Most of all, he noticed how Eliza herself had changed, not in manner, but in bearing. She did not claim authority, yet she no longer shrank from attention. She occupied space as though it were hers by right. One evening, when Nathan had finally been able to sit upright and eat without assistance, Caleb asked Eliza to walk with him along the fence line. The prairie was quiet at that hour, the air cooling as the sun dipped low. For a while they walked in silence, boots crunching softly against the dry earth. "You understand," Caleb said at last, "that things cannot return to how they were." Eliza nodded. "Yes, sir. You saved my son," he continued. "But more than that, you showed me something I had spent my life ignoring." She did not respond. She had learned when silence was respect and when it was fear. This was neither. It was patience. "I won't have you remain here as you were," Caleb said. "That would be an insult to you and to what you've done." Eliza stopped walking. "I never asked for more than my work, sir." "I know," he replied. "That is precisely why you deserve more." His decision, once spoken, felt inevitable. Eliza would leave the ranch not in disgrace, but in opportunity. Caleb's sister lived in Denver, a woman of practical mind and progressive habits. She needed a companion, someone capable, someone steady. "You'll have access to books," Caleb said, "to conversation, to a life beyond service." Eliza felt a tightening in her chest, not fear this time, but something like grief for a life she had already begun to outgrow. "And Nathan?" she asked. "He will recover," Caleb said, "and he will need to learn to stand on his own again. As we all do." Margaret's reaction was swift and cold. "You are sending her away," she said later that night, disbelief sharpening her words. After everything, Caleb met her gaze without flinching. "I am giving her a future." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what of mine?" That question lingered longer than she intended. In the days that followed, Nathan grew stronger and quieter. The illness had left its mark not only on his body, but on his understanding of the world. He watched people differently now. He noticed who stayed, who spoke, who listened. One afternoon, he asked Eliza to sit. "I remember your voice," he said, "when I couldn't see anything else clearly." She smiled faintly. "Then I spoke too much." "No," he replied. "You spoke when it mattered." He paused, then added, "I don't think I would have been the man I was meant to be if things had gone differently." Eliza understood what he was offering, not gratitude alone, but absolution for a future neither of them would share. She accepted it with a nod. When Eliza arrived in Denver weeks later, the city unsettled her at first. The noise, the pace, the closeness of it all. It was a far cry from the open land she had known. But Caleb's sister welcomed her without condescension, placing books in her hands as easily as others placed brooms. It was there that Eliza met Dr. Samuel Reed. He was not what she expected. Younger than most physicians she had known, with eyes that listened before his mouth spoke. He asked questions. He considered answers. When Eliza mentioned willow bark in passing, he did not scoff. "Of course," he said. "It's been used for generations." No one had ever said "of course" to her knowledge before. Their conversations grew about medicine, about responsibility, about the quiet arrogance that often accompanied formal learning. Samuel never spoke down to her. He never spoke over her. He treated her mind as something worth engaging. Back at the ranch, the distance created clarity. Nathan ended his engagement with Margaret not in anger but in honesty. She left without spectacle, her pride wounded more deeply than she would ever admit. Caleb watched her go with a sense of finality he did not mourn. Life reshaped itself. Eliza found herself standing at a threshold she had never imagined, no longer invisible, yet not entirely certain where she belonged. Samuel noticed the hesitation. You don't owe anyone a role, he told her one evening. Only yourself. The words stayed with her. When Samuel asked her quietly, without ceremony, whether she would consider building a life beside him rather than behind him, Eliza did not answer right away. She thought of the prairie, of the hallway where she had first spoken, of the cost of silence. Yes, she said at last. I would. Far away under the same wide sky, Caleb Harrington stood on his land and understood that wealth did not endure through control alone. It endured through what one was willing to change. The frontier remained harsh, unforgiving. But in its vastness, something new had taken root, something quiet, resilient, and impossible to ignore. And it was only the beginning. A meaningful life is rarely loud. Its proof is found in who is lifted along the way. The small clinic stood at the edge of Denver, where the streets thinned and the noise softened, a modest building with wide windows and a door that was rarely closed. There was no sign boasting miracles, no polished brass plate announcing prestige. People found it because someone told them it was there, because word traveled faster than reputation when kindness proved consistent. Eliza learned over time that healing did not always announce itself the way crisis did. It arrived quietly in children who returned to school, in women who slept through the night without pain, in men who came back to work with steadier hands. Samuel worked beside her, never ahead of her, and never behind. Decisions were made together, questions were asked without offense. Disagreements ended in understanding rather than victory. They married without ceremony, grand enough to invite comment. Those who attended remembered the stillness more than the vows, the way Eliza stood composed and certain, and the way Samuel watched her as though he were still learning how such steadiness was possible. Back on the prairie, Nathan Harrington walked the land differently than he had before. Recovery had given him more than strength. It had given him perspective. He listened now to the men who worked the cattle, to the women who managed the house, to voices he once would have passed without hearing. The illness had stripped away his assumptions, leaving behind a quieter sense of responsibility. When he proposed funding small clinics along the outlying ranches, some questioned the expense. Nathan answered simply, "Distance should not decide who lives." Caleb Harrington watched his son with a pride tempered by humility. The land was still his, the cattle still bore his mark, but his grip on control had loosened. He visited Eliza and Samuel once, standing awkwardly in the clinic doorway, unsure of his place there. Eliza greeted him, as she always had, with respect, but without deference. "You built something that lasts," Caleb said, gesturing around the room. Eliza shook her head gently. "We did." He accepted the correction. Margaret Collins did not return. Her life continued elsewhere, framed by circles that prized appearances she could still manage. Occasionally, her name surfaced in conversation, then faded again. The story no longer required her. Years passed. The frontier changed, as it always had, slowly, unevenly. Towns grew, rail lines crept closer, and the old certainty of isolation began to thin. Through it all, the clinic remained adapting without losing its purpose. Eliza trained others, passing on what she knew without guarding it as territory. Knowledge she had learned gained value only when shared. One evening after the last patient had gone and the lamps were being lit, Eliza stood at the window and watched the sky deepen into dusk. Samuel joined her, silent, content to wait. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked finally. She nodded. "Sometimes." "Does it feel far away?" "No," she said. "It feels like the beginning." She remembered the hallway at the Harrington Ranch, the weight of the silence, the danger of being heard. She remembered how small she had felt, and how little that had mattered once she spoke. Eliza turned back toward the room, toward the life they had built, not through ambition, but through attention. She understood now that courage was not a single act, but a practice. It was choosing again and again to respond rather than retreat. Outside, the world continued in its imperfect way. Inside, something steady endured, and though no songs were written of her, and no titles attached to her name, the proof of her life moved quietly through the frontier. In every breath eased, every fear softened, every person lifted just enough to stand on their own. That Eliza knew was enough. History often remembers the loud and the powerful. But the frontier was shaped just as much by those who acted without applause. Eliza never sought to rise above others, only to stand where she was needed. And in doing so, she proved that the quietest courage can leave the deepest mark. Not because it demands to be seen, but because it refuses to look away.